to Business Research and Statistics video lecture. I am Dr. Elise of Brannon-Little, and I will be covering Chapter 12, Measurement, Scaling, Reliability, and Validity. This chapter will start preparing you to think in terms of the power of scales for increasing levels of sophistication in the data analysis process. You will also be given explanations about the different rating and ranking scales, and hopefully you'll understand how scaling techniques are applied and how some of the rating scales are treated as Likert type interval scales. I want to stress the importance of establishing the goodness of measurements, and this chapter covers the different types of validity and reliability. So I will begin with the discussion questions because they provide an overview of the course content for this chapter. First, we're going to look at 4 types of scales. There is nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. A nominal scale separates individuals or items into categories. For example, juniors and seniors. The ordinal scale helps to rank order with those separated items. The interval scale helps to determine the extent to which the items are different from each other. In other words, is there a difference between 1 and 2? Or is it the same as the difference between 4 and 5? The ratio scale helps to determine the proportion of differences among items since it has an absolute 0 origin and is the most powerful of those 4 scales. These 4 scales are also called levels of measurement. And to put it simplistically, nominal is a label, a category, or a name. Ordinal is a rank, and interval ratio is a number. The next question is, how is the interval scale more sophisticated than the nominal and ordinal scales? Whereas the nominal and ordinal scales group and rank the objects respectively, in the interval scale, in addition, also indicates the magnitude of the differences. The distance between any 2 points in an interval scale is the same. If an individual prefers A to B and another prefers C to D, then we know that the difference in the magnitude of the preferences of both individuals is the same. If this is captured on an interval scale rather than on an ordinal scale, then you could see this illustration. Because of the above reason, an interval scale lends itself to more sophisticated statistical analysis. The mean and the standard deviation can be calculated for the variables tapped on an interval scale, which cannot be done on an ordinal scale. The next question is, why is the ratio scale the most powerful of those 4 levels of measurement? The ratio scale is the most powerful of the 4 because it not only indicates the magnitude, but the proportion of the differences. Whereas the interval scale only indicates the distance between any of the 2 points on the scale that is the same. And any identical additional or subtractions will maintain the differences. The ratio scale, because it has a true 0 origin, also indicates the proportion of the differences. A person with an IQ of 150 is expected to be 2 times as intelligent as a person that has an IQ of 75. Any division or multiplication of the data by the same number will still maintain this proportion. Because of this, the geometric mean and the coefficient of variation can be calculated. Next, I want to look at the difference between attitude rating scales and ranking scales. As their names indicate, ranking scales rank the order of preferences, whereas rating scales rate subjects on a continuum. Ranking scales are used with ordinal data. Remember, ordinal refers to rank. And rating scales with interval data. While the latter, the rating scales, lend themselves to sophisticated analysis, such as calculating the mean and the standard deviation, the former lends itself to less sophistication, non-parametric statistical analysis. An attitudinal scale, they are used for measuring nebulous subjective concepts such as attraction and weariness, where states of mind, feelings, and impressions are tapped. Ranking scales are used to tap preferences among objects, such as preferences for types of nursing homes or schools, etc. Why is it important to establish the goodness of measures, and how is it done? The goodness of measures indicates whether the scale that we use is reliable and valid. In other words, they indicate to what extent we can accurately measure the concept or reliability, and whether we are indeed measuring whatever we are supposed to measure, which is the validity. If we're not measuring the intended concept accurately, then our study will not yield the correct results. Reliability is established by assessing the stability of the measure through test, retest reliability, and a parallel form of reliability, and internal consistency of the measure. So validity is established through the construct validity, criterion related validity, and congruent validity. Basically, in simple terms, reliability is running a test over and over and over and getting the same or pretty close to the same results. And validity is if you're measuring what you're supposed to measure. In your textbook, it talks about those 4 types of scales in the beginning of the chapter. And then it goes on to talk about the different types, it concludes with talking about validity and reliability, which we'll get to in just a few minutes. But before that, I want to go over the difference between formative and reflective scales. A reflective scale, the items, all of the items, are expected to correlate. Unlike the items in a formative scale, which we'll discuss next, each item is in a reflective scale is assumed to share a common basis, the underlying construct of the interest. An increase in the value of the construct would translate to an increase in the value of all of the items represented in the construct. The formative scale is used when a construct, such as, for instance, job satisfaction, is viewed as an explanatory combination of its indicators, such as promotion, pace, satisfaction, and so forth. That is when a change in any one of the indicators or their dimensions is expected to change the score of the overall construct, regardless of the value of the other indicators. Why does this not make sense? Or, to be able to assess the internal consistency of a formative scale. While it makes sense to test the inter-item consistency of reflective scales, it does not make sense to test the inter-item consistency of formative scales. For this reason, we do not expect the items in formative scales to be homogeneous. In other words, we do not expect all of the items to correlate. For this reason, tests of the consistency of respondents' answers to the items of informative measure do not tell us anything about the quality of our measuring instrument. So here I want to note that there are other methods to assess the goodness of formative scales. And you can research or look at them further. They would be, for example, Jarvis or the McKinsey, or you can look at some others that these particular researchers have found. Next, the job involvement, consider this statement, the job involvement measure described in the appendix is reflective in nature. Yes, it could be reflective in nature. Each item in this scale is shared by some common basis, the underlying construct of interest in the case of job involvement. An increase in the value of the construct will translate into an increase in the value of all of the items represented in the construct. So here's another statement. Whenever possible, it is advisable to use instruments that have already been developed and repeatedly used in published studies rather than develop your own instruments to your studies. So, do you agree to this statement? It is always advisable to use well-validated instruments that have already been repeatedly used in published studies, rather than going through the cumbersome process of developing your own instruments. However, simply because an instrument is used in a published study does not necessarily make it a good instrument. It is always wise to examine the psychometric properties established for the instrument before using it. In case this is not easily available, a pilot study can be conducted to see if the measures have at least acceptable reliability. And the last statement I want you to consider is this. A valid instrument is always reliable, but a reliable instrument is not always valid. If the instrument is valid, especially in terms of content validity, we would expect to have reliable instruments. However, if the instrument can have both consistency and stability, but not be measured on what it is intended to measure, for example, have low validity, then the instrument does measure the concept that it's supposed to measure, it will be reliable. Thus, a valid instrument will be reliable, but a reliable instrument may not be valid, if that makes sense. So again, I go back to the textbook where you can look at the goodness of measure section, where it's talking about reliability and validity. Reliability is a test of consistency in measuring instruments, basically over and over and over. And then validity is concerned with whether you're measuring the right concept. The reliability and the stability and the consistency of the measure are all considered in validity. In the final project, you are required to discuss reliability and validity. Everyone has to include a section of this in your final project. Go through the information. There are different types of validity that is discussed in your text, in this chapter, and there are different types of reliability that is discussed in this chapter. Basically, focus on the term itself, reliability and validity, running the test over and over, it being reliable, and measuring the right concept, it being valid, when it comes to your research project. That will conclude our discussion of Chapter 12, which is all about measurement, scaling, reliability, and validity. If you have questions, please contact me via email, and I will respond within 24 hours or less. Until the next video lecture, have a great week.